Hey guys, Lord Naren White here, the Holy Ghost, the one true God. With you with the next video in my series reading Oliver Twist as read by Lord Naren White. Without further ado, returning to Oliver Twist by Charles Dickens. The building rang with a tremendous shout, and another, and then it echoed loud groans that gathered strength as they swelled out like angry thunder. It was a peal of joy from the populace outside, greeting the news that he would die on Monday. The noise subsided, and he was asked if he had anything to say why the sentence of death should not be passed upon him. He had resumed his listening attitude, and looked intently at his questioner while the demand was made. But it was twice repeated before he seemed to hear it, and then he was only muttered that he was an old man, and so dropping into a whisper was silent again. The judge assumed the black cap, and the prisoner still stood with the same air and gesture. A woman in the gallery uttered some exclamation, called forth by this dread solemnity. He looked hastily up as if angry at the interruption, and bent forward yet more attentively. The address was solemn and impressive, the sentence fearful to hear. But he stood like a marble figure, without the motion of a nerve. His haggard face was still thrust forward, his under jaw hanging down, and his eyes staring out before him, when the jailer put his hand upon his arm and beckoned him away. He gazed stupidly about him for an instant and obeyed. They led him through a paved room under the court, where some prisoners were waiting till their turns came, and others were talking to their friends, who crowded round a grate which looked into the open yard. There was nobody there to speak to him, but as he passed, the prisoners fell back to render him more visible to the people, who were clinging to the bars, and they assailed him with opprobrious names, and screeched and hissed. He shook his fist, and would have spat upon them, but his conductors hurried him on through a gloomy passage, lighted by a few dim lamps into the interior of the prison. Here he was searched, that he might not have about him the means of anticipating the law. This ceremony performed, they led him to one of the condemned cells and left him there alone. He sat down on a stone bench opposite the door, which served for seat and bedstead, and, casting his bloodshot eyes upon the ground, tried to collect his thoughts. After a while he began to remember a few disjointed fragments of what the judge had said, though it had seemed to place him at the time that he could not hear a word. These he gradually fell into their proper places, and by degrees suggested more, so that in a little time he had the whole almost as if it was delivered. To be hanged by the neck till he was dead. That was the end, to be hanged by the neck till he was dead. As it came on very dark, he began to think of all the men he had known who had died upon the scaffold, some of them through his means. They rose up in such quick succession that he could hardly count them. He had seen some of them die, and had joked too, because they died with prayers upon their lips. With what a rattling noise the drop went down, and how suddenly they changed from strong and vigorous men to the dangling heaps of clothes. Some of them might have inhabited that very cell, sat upon that very spot. It was very dark. Why didn't they bring a light? The cell had been built for many years. Scores of men must have passed their last hours there. It was like sitting in a vault strewn with dead bodies, the cap, the noose, the pinioned arms, the faces that he knew, even beneath that hideous veil. Light! Light! At length, when his hands were raw with beating against that heavy door and walls, two men appeared, one bearing a candle, which he thrust into an iron candlestick fixed against the wall, the other dragging in a mattress on the which to pass the night, for the prisoner was to be left alone no more. Then came the night, dark, dismal, silent night. Other watchers are glad to hear this church clock strike, for they tell of life and coming day. To him they brought despair. The boom of every iron bell came laden with the one deep hollow sound, death. What availed the noise and bustle of cheerful morning, which penetrated even there to him? It was another form of knell with mockery added to the warning. The day passed off. Day? There was no day. It was gone as soon as come, And night came on again, night so long and yet so short, long in its dreadful silence and short in its fleeting hours. At one time he raved and blasphemed, and at another howled and tore his hair. Venerable men of his own persuasion had come to pray beside him, but he had driven them away with curses. They renewed their charitable efforts, and he beat them off. Saturday night. He had only one night more to live, and as he thought of this, the day broke Sunday. It was not until the night of this last awful day that a withering sense of his helpless, desperate state came in its full intensity upon his blighted soul. Not that he had ever held any defined or positive hope of mercy, but that he had never been able to consider more than the dim probability of dying so soon. He had spoken little to either of the two men who relieved each other in their attendance upon him, and they, for their parts, made no effort to rouse his attention. He had sat there, awake but dreaming. Now he started up every minute, and with gasping mouth and burning skin hurried to and fro, in such a paroxysm of fear and wrath that even they, used to such sights, recoiled from him with horror. He grew so terrible at last in all the tortures of his evil conscience that one man could not bear to sit there, eyeing him alone, and so the two kept watch together. He cowered upon his stone bed and thought of the past. He had been wounded with some missiles from the crowd on the day of his capture, and his head was bandaged with a linen cloth. His red hair hung down upon his bloodless face. His beard was torn and twisted into knots. His eyes shone with a terrible light. His unwashed flesh crackled with the fever that burned him up. 8, 9, then. If it was not a trick to frighten him, and those were the real hours treading on each other's heels, where would he be when they came round again? 11. Another struck before the voice of the previous hour had ceased to vibrate. At 8 he would be the only mourner in his own funeral train. At 11. Those dreadful walls of Newgate, which have hidden so much misery and such unspeakable anguish not only from the eyes, but, too often and too long, from the thoughts of men, never held so dread a spectacle as that. The few who lingered as they passed and wondered what the man was doing who was to be hanged tomorrow would have slept but ill that night if they could have seen him. From early in the evening until nearly midnight, little groups of 2 and 3 presented themselves at the lodge gate, and inquired with anxious faces whether any reprieve had been received. These, being answered in the negative, communicated the welcome intelligence to the clusters in the street, who pointed out to one another the door from which he must come out, and showed where the scaffold would be built, and, walking with unwilling steps away, turned back to conjure up the scene. By degrees they fell off, one by one, and, for an hour in the dead of night, the street was left to solitude and darkness. The space before the prison was cleared, and a few strong barriers, painted black, had been already thrown across the road to break the pressure of the expected crowd. When Mr. Brownlow and Oliver appeared at the wicket, and presented an order of admission to the prisoner, signed by one of the sheriffs, they were immediately admitted into the lodge. "Is the young gentleman to come too, sir?" said the man whose duty it was to conduct them. "It is not a sight for children, sir." "It is indeed not, my friend," rejoined Mr. Brownlow, "but my business with this man is intimately connected with him, as this child has seen him in the full career of his success and villainy, I think it as well, even at the cost of some pain and fear, that he should see him now." These few words had been said apart, so as to be inaudible to Oliver. The man touched his hat, and, glancing at Oliver with some curiosity, opened another gate, opposite to that by which they had entered, and led them on through dark and winding ways towards the cells. "This," said the man, stopping in a gloomy passage where a couple of workmen were making some preparations in profound silence, "this is the place he passes through. If you step this way, you can see the door he goes out at." And we'll go ahead and stop there for this week. As usual, I want to say thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed. Please like, comment, and subscribe, as it greatly helps the channel. Light be with you all. Take care and thanks again.